I want to just talk for a second about who we are, the Governor's Resiliency and Recovery Office in Colorado. We were created 2 days after the 2013 floods, and the governor recognized that the event that we went through was different from anything that our state had seen before. And there was a need from the governor's office level to partner with state agencies to maintain a really strong sense of urgency throughout the recovery process to, as Larry mentioned, coordinate a portfolio of more than 30 funding sources. But our mission has evolved over time, given that we want to consider how we can hopefully change our story before the next time it rains or the next time the hills burn like they did in 2012. I just want to take a second, and I see Brian Varela from our Colorado team out there, and he was talking about how personal floods are for the folks that are impacted by them. And why do we do the work that we do? It's ultimately about people, and it's ultimately about communities. And oftentimes when we're working through regulations or rules of grant programs or policies or dealing with challenges, we can forget that, but we need to remind ourselves this is about people. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about not the Resiliency and Recovery Office's story, but Colorado's story. And it represents the work of a lot of folks from local government, from state government, from our federal partners, but also from the private sector. And there are a number of folks from private sector organizations here who have really contributed to our recovery and our resilience efforts. So I just want to run through the numbers really quickly. They really speak for themselves. First and foremost, since 2012, thousands and thousands of Colorados have had their lives changed, really forever. $5 billion of losses from wildfires, from floods, $1.7 billion of federal, state, local resources, and we are most grateful for those resources. We couldn't do what we're doing with our recovery process without. We've had more than 3,000 homes destroyed by floods and wildfires, and while the numbers are small compared to some coastal disasters, they are massive for an interior mountain state like Colorado. So I could talk all day about a recovery process. I know we have a lot of experts out there who have been involved in recovery, but I want to talk mostly about our resiliency process and start with why are we throwing around this great buzzword of resilience or resiliency. In Colorado, that's for several reasons. First, we know that we have had record disasters, we've had a history of disasters, and we know they will happen again. And so we need to stay on top of managing our risk and talking about it. Second, we know that Colorado is growing and growing rapidly. We're talking about 50% population growth in the next 20 years. And if we don't get ahead of the curve, again, we could have some bigger challenges. Third, we know that climate is changing. We know that conditions are changing, and that means our risk profile is changing. And fourth, we know that federal policy is going to be changing over time. We know that the federal government wants to see more action from states and wants to see more action from local communities to manage their risk before a disaster happens. And all of that leads to what we want to do ultimately is to preserve and enhance our way of life in the face of these challenges. So that leads me to the Colorado Resiliency Framework. Back in 2014, we brought together a team of state, local, federal, and non-governmental partners just to have an initial conversation about what this word even means to us. I think it can at times be a little bit nebulous when we throw around resilience or resiliency, but we wanted to have a conversation, and the first thing we realized is that we wanted to have a roadmap, an actionable roadmap to actually act on resilience, and that's where the Colorado Resiliency Framework was born. It was catalyzed by the floods and fires that we had in 2012 and 2013, but it's really a forward-looking document. It's about what we do not to recover from the last 3 years, but more about what we do for the next 20, 30, 50 years going forward. It was adopted by the governor in May of 2015. I'll talk a little bit about engagement, but we had direct contributions from more than 150 folks and a lot of indirect contributions beyond that. And it's something that we're acting on. Each year we release a plan with the actions we plan to take that year to actually bring it to life. So I'll talk about the definition of resiliency first. I know that there are a million different definitions of resilience out there. This one happens to be ours, and we know that it may not be perfect. Some folks may think that it is rife with buzzwords, But it's something that's very intentional for us. It's something that helps us to keep our mission in mind as we move forward. And some of those key words like thriving, we want to be sure our communities can thrive in the face of those conditions that I talked about. Healthy growth, we know that folks are coming to Colorado and coming quickly. It's a great place to live. And so we want to be able to manage that growth in a safe, in a sustainable, and an ecologically responsible way as well. Durable systems, we want our infrastructure to maintain operability during and after disaster events. We want to conserve our resources. Water is going to be a challenge not just when there's too much from a flood, but also when there's too little from a drought. Another piece about our resilience framework is that it's integrated and it's interdisciplinary. The slides may be a little bit too small for you to read all of the sectors we have in our framework, but you can go to coloradounited.com and actually download it. But the point being that we got our economic, we got our housing, our transportation, our watershed folks at the same table to have the same conversation and integrate our actions as one big team. One point I want to underscore about resilience is that it's not just about the shock events, it's not just about the floods and the wildfires, but we do have to consider our stresses as well. We have to consider things like affordable housing. Do our folks who lose their houses during a flood have the ability to find an affordable place to live in the community that they lived in before the event? Is that a safe place to live? Is the economy diverse? There are a number of issues that arise after a disaster event that were chronic challenges before, and that can change the story as to whether a community recovers quickly or not. One important point about the framework is engagement. I mentioned the 150 stakeholders that were involved in actually putting the document together. But we also engaged with local governments. We did focus groups, more than 450 surveys. We interviewed a lot of experts in various different fields, from business to floodplain management and beyond, to try to get more voices than ourselves into this document and ensure that we were representing not just a few flood-impacted communities, but the entire state of Colorado. And that's leading us to where we go from here. We are, I will admit, building the plane as we fly it, and that's a lot of work. But we have identified three major sort of cornerstones of our resiliency effort. The first is around culture, and ultimately what we want to do with our resilience framework and with our efforts overall is to change culture from a reactive culture to a proactive culture where we can minimize our risk and, again, where we can thrive in the face of challenges. So we're going to be investing in efforts that do a lot of bottom-up engagement that really have direct conversations with citizens, with businesses, with local governments. The second piece of that is risk is really fundamental to any sort of resilience effort. And believe it or not, we had 28 counties, nearly half of the state, that had paper maps from the 1970s. And so we're trying to move forward with risk information. And the third piece is that we're trying to use our culture and our risk efforts to inform capital investments in a wise way. So we've started with our culture efforts. We've piloted 3 local resiliency planning processes in disaster-impacted communities and plan to take that statewide. But we're seeing from our local communities some really innovative bottom-up engagement efforts that are building trust before a disaster happens, and they're building those networks that are not just government-centric. Risk-informed decision-making. Our Colorado Water Conservation Board and Department of Transportation updated hydrology right after the floods, and we found out our risk was a lot higher than we realized. In some cases, the hydrology doubled from what we understood it to be before the floods. So now we've worked with the legislature, got about $7 million to update our floodplain maps while we're still in our recovery process, so we're building with the right information and avoiding losses the next time around. Our Department of Local Affairs also worked on a hazard mitigation and land use solution guide that you can find at planningforhazards.com. Colorado is a home rule state, and that's not going to change, but we want to put tools in communities' hands to be able to do the right thing, and there are a number of flexible tools. The last piece is capital investments, and we're really testing this with our recovery process. This is an example of the way that we're rebuilding our steep mountain canyons, really through those partnerships that I've talked about from transportation, Water Conservation Board, local watershed coalitions. Before, our roads were built on fill, and they were encroaching on the streams. And just like they did in 1976, we had hundreds of miles of road just completely wash out in those canyons. So we're trying to change that story with this flood and then use those practices to move forward with more resilient capital investments before a disaster happens. Give the stream more room to meander. Move the road over to bedrock, which certainly includes a lot of dynamite to make it happen. Last piece that I'll touch on before I wrap up is this whole notion of portfolio management. There is no single resource that's going to be able to solve all of your resiliency needs. And so this is an example of our Big Thompson Canyon. We have 3 different federal funding sources, state money, local money, but we're trying to manage it as one big project, design our projects together, have all the folks at the same table to hopefully change the story the next time around. So where are we going? Certainly implementing the vision of the framework. We're advocating relentlessly for funding, and if any of our federal partners I'm looking at over on the stage here have extra loose change in the couch over there, we're willing to take it and use it in Colorado. We want to engage the private sector as a partner. We believe they have a place at the table. And then, of course, support grassroots engagement and build that culture, change that culture so that we can be proactive before the next event. So I'll leave it there.